Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live Gibson Dunn Webcast, COVID-19 Vaccines, Employer Strategies, and Considerations. I'm Jessica Brown, a labor and employment partner with Gibson Dunn, and I'm here with my litigation and employment law partner, Lauren Elliott. Thank you so much for being here. We hope that you and all of your extended families are safe and well. A few announcements before we get started. First, if you experience technical difficulty at any time during this webcast, please submit your question in the Q&A panel on your screen, and we will assist you. Please note that you are part of a very large audience today. For privacy reasons, the attendee list is not displayed. All attendees will be in listen-only mode for today's event, and as a reminder, this event is being recorded. The recording will be available on Gibson Dunn's website in the next few days. Second, MCLE forms are available for download in the resource list window. The webcast slides are also available on the resource list. Participants should complete the MCLE form and email it to cle@gibsondunn.com, and that contact information is provided. Lauren and I are excited to present on this quickly evolving and very timely topic. Just this Monday, Bloomberg reported that more than 138 million vaccine doses have been administered in 73 countries. They also noted that the MSCI World Index of Global Stocks is up 16% since January 23rd. I gotta say, I've gotten so used to Zoom over the last year that it now seems odd not to be on camera. But just know that Lauren and I would be happy to schedule a Zoom meeting with anyone who wants to discuss vaccination in further detail. I've been doing a fair amount of that with clients recently, and in fact, one client, a biopharmaceutical company, recently invited me to join their executive committee meeting, and I just let them pepper me with questions for about 45 minutes, which was really fun. Subsequently, we helped them with their job description because they wanted to make vaccination a condition of hiring, and we talked through those issues. So keep that in mind. Lauren and I are happy to discuss these issues individually and help you all navigate these choppy, uncharted waters. Today, we probably won't be able to take questions, unfortunately. We had almost 1,000 registrants for today, which means so many questions, and we only have an hour, but we received about 25 questions in advance and have incorporated many of them into our presentation. We're sure that questions will remain even after we're finished today, and again, we encourage you to reach out to us. Our email addresses will display on the final slide. You may also send questions using the Q&A feature that I mentioned. We'll try to capture those questions and respond individually afterwards. One other thing we wanted to say at the outset is that this is an area that is very much in flux. So everything we say truly is subject to change. That means you'll need to pay attention to developments at the federal, state, and local level. This is all rapidly evolving. And of course, none of what we discuss should be considered legal advice or is creating an attorney-client relationship. The last thing I'll say before turning it over to Lauren to get us started on the slides is that I was reading an article the other day, which I shared with Lauren, from The Atlantic. It encouraged employers to mandate vaccines on the theory that if employers don't, no one will. And given all the anti-vaccine sentiment, or at least vaccine hesitancy in our country, including among certain underrepresented groups, that we wouldn't be able to benefit from the vaccine as much as we otherwise could. And we'll talk about employer mandates, of course, as well as other options. But there was also a quote in the article that jumped out at me. It said, "The delegation of public health decision-making to the private sector might also accelerate the consolidation of market power. Large employers and big corporations will be better able to assess and implement health policies that are good for their business. A vaccinated workplace may become a competitive edge, and large employers will then be better positioned to purchase vaccines and mandate them. Smaller employers and their workers will suffer as their stores, restaurants, and workplaces are left unvaccinated." With that, I'm turning it over to Lauren.
Hello, everyone. Let's start with the current state of play. You should be looking at an image right now, which I am sure is very familiar to all of you. On December 14th, 2020, the first COVID-19 vaccines were administered in the United States. Sandra Lindsay, a critical care nurse at Long Island Jewish Medical Center, was the first nurse to receive the vaccine. So let's talk about the vaccines that are available today and are likely to be available in the next month or so. As all of you know, I'm sure, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines have been available since December, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine will hopefully be available to the public probably sometime in March. One of the key pieces of information that is relevant to this presentation and to the understanding of the science is the efficacy rate of these vaccines. The Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which are considered messenger RNA vaccines, it's a new technology that has proven to produce a very, very strong immune response, are up in the 95% efficacy rate, which is, it was a surprise to everyone to have such high effectiveness. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine also has a very, very high efficacy rate. It only looks low compared to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. It's 66% overall effective, but in the U.S. it's in the 70s. But the important piece of information to note is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is 85% effective in preventing severe cases, which makes it a very important tool that we're going to be using, the public will be relying on in fighting this virus. There's universal consensus that the best weapon and the most effective weapon we have right now in defeating this virus will be these vaccines. But we do have to understand that even with a 95% efficacy rate that you'll find with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, you are going to have a small but significant segment of the population that is not going to be protected by the vaccine. And that's just something that we have to keep in mind as we proceed forward and formulate policies and understand how best to protect our workers. The other interesting aspect that people have to understand is that unlike the vaccines that we're most accustomed to using, these vaccines are authorized through something called the emergency use authorization. People need to understand that while that is not an FDA approval, the authorization was only issued upon a demonstration of safety and efficacy. These vaccines would not have received their authorization if they couldn't demonstrate their safety and couldn't demonstrate their effectiveness. They were subject to phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials. The Pfizer vaccine involved trials of over 40,000 participants. The Moderna vaccine involved trials of close to 35,000 participants, and my understanding is the J&J vaccine involved a clinical trial also up in the range of 40 or so thousand participants. So there is substantial evidence to support the FDA's finding and determination that these vaccines should be made available to the public and be put in public use. The important thing for purposes of the timing of formulating a policy regarding vaccinations is understanding when vaccines will be made available to the general public, to most people or to everyone. Obviously, a number of them are available to certain segments of the public based on regulations issued by individual states. But experts estimate that by the end of the summer, possibly early fall, vaccines will be available to everyone. As of early this week, over 40 million vaccine doses have been administered, and the hope is that when we hit the end of the summer, all of us, regardless of age and pre-existing conditions, will be in a position to obtain our vaccines. That is the only exception to that will be children. As many of you may know, these vaccines have only been approved for individuals over 16 or 18 years of age, and they are currently being tested in children under those ages. And so they may not be available to children at that point in time. But the important thing is by the time we hit June or July, they should be available to all individuals that are members of your workforce. The next slide shows that notwithstanding the fact that we have vaccines available and that there are great therapeutics that have been approved and outpatient therapies, the death rate is still very high. And we show this slide just to stress again the importance that vaccines will be in defeating this disease. We hit, luckily in the last couple of days, the death rate has dropped, but in early February, I believe, we were up at a spike of almost 5,000 deaths in a given day in the United States alone. Many scientists attribute that to the holidays, which led to an increase in positivity rate, and that led to an increase in hospitalizations, and from that we ended up with a spike in deaths. Another spike is always a possibility in the future, and we're also seeing spikes outside the United States, which could pose a threat to people here in the United States. So why are we giving this presentation? The reason we are is that a number of our clients are asking what are their options. Can they mandate? Can they, should they consider a voluntary program? And they are also interested in what other employers are doing. And so overall, what we are seeing now, and I think we're going to see more and more as we approach the summer, is that some employers are considering mandating vaccines or something what we would call a conditional mandate, which might be that they are mandating vaccination for anybody who wants to re-enter the office or anyone who wants to participate in firm-wide events or any worker who wants to be in a position to be on site for a client. So that is something we're starting to see more and more of. We are also seeing that companies are considering strongly encouraging vaccination, which could range from a persuasion campaign to incentives. One of the things to keep in mind is that incentives, if they become more than de minimis, can be viewed as effectively mandating vaccines. So we just have to be careful when we talk about incentives, and you'll hear more about that from Jessica later in the presentation, as to how they're framed and what the repercussions could be, depending on what kind of incentive program people implement. Some employers are considering making vaccines available without expressly endorsing them. And then I think the majority of people are really right now taking what we call a wait and see approach to see what other people are doing and see how the law evolves. One of the key things to remember is that there is no right answer for everyone. Deciding what your policy should be probably depends a lot on the industry you're in. And the context in which your workers are going to be interacting with each other or interacting with the public. A policy that works for healthcare individuals who are interacting with a vulnerable population, that may be a circumstance that would require mandating vaccines, or at least would compel some type of mandatory policy. An industry such as the meatpacking industry, which has been subject to widespread infections because of how closely individuals have to work together and the contact they have with each other, may also be an industry where mandating vaccines might be more compelling. While IT consultants who have, during the pandemic, been able to conduct their work and do their essential duties from a remote location without having interaction with others, there may not be as compelling a reason to mandate or strongly encourage vaccination. So while we'll talk about today how you can approach vaccination, you have to always remember a lot will depend on the context in which you have your industry and the context in which your workers will be engaging with each other and engaging with the public.
Great. Thanks, Lauren. Jessica, again, another very frequently asked question, including by participants today, is just the basic threshold question of can employers mandate COVID-19 vaccinations? So on Monday, December 14th, pretty much right after the Pfizer vaccine was authorized for emergency use, Gibson Dunn released a client alert called An Employer Playbook for the COVID Vaccination Wars, Strategies and Considerations for Workplace Vaccination Policies. Lauren and I had put the playbook together along with a former colleague of ours, and in it, we noted that early polling suggested deep skepticism about the vaccines, with many in the population indicating that if offered the vaccine, they would refuse. So we noted that employers might prefer to stay on the sidelines of these vaccine wars, but that, like it or not, America's workplaces would be on the front lines of this debate and likely would need to consider whether to pursue a mandatory vaccination program or merely encourage voluntary compliance. So we sort of assumed that employers would have the right to mandate vaccines. And then 2 days later, on December 16th, the EEOC released its COVID vaccine guidance, confirming that indeed employers may mandate vaccination, essentially because the EEOC has said that COVID-19 constitutes a direct threat in most workplaces. Therefore, the EEOC guidance indicated that employers can mandate vaccination subject to reasonable accommodation requirements for people with medical disabilities under the ADA or sincerely held religious practices or beliefs under Title VII. And so even though it was consistent with our playbook, we updated the playbook to reflect the helpful guidance from the EEOC that was issued on December 16th, and a copy of that updated playbook should be in the materials that are posted for you today. Now, whether employers can mandate vaccines was the most frequently asked question today, as I mentioned, and we've now answered that question in the affirmative. But it is still somewhat context dependent, of course, as Lauren was really just explaining. If your entire workforce works remotely from home and doesn't come into contact with anyone except over Zoom, there is no direct threat to address, and it doesn't make sense and probably wouldn't be appropriate to mandate vaccination. But most employers can, and the EEOC has made that fairly clear. Whether employers should mandate vaccination is a different question that we'll be discussing. Another frequently asked question is this: subject to exceptions for religion and disabilities, can employees be terminated if they refuse to be vaccinated? Well, it's definitely possible. If an employee is at will and is neither disabled nor basing their refusal on any sincerely held religious belief or practice, but is just refusing for political or philosophical reasons, or a sincerely held belief that vaccines are dangerous, well, they can be terminated then, assuming that they don't have any other legal rights that need to be respected. If they're disabled or basing their refusal on a sincerely held religious belief, however, then there is a duty of reasonable accommodation, which Lauren will discuss a bit more in a little while. But as you can see here, the EEOC says that if there is no reasonable accommodation possible, then it would be lawful for the employer to exclude the employee from the workplace. Now, the EEOC guidance is clear that this is not the same as termination. The EEOC wants to make sure that employers are taking a close look at all other laws and contracts that might protect an employee from losing their job simply because they can't be vaccinated and no reasonable accommodation is possible. An example might be a driver whose job involves having very close contact with particularly vulnerable populations, elderly and sick people, whom the driver is taking to their medical appointments. If that driver can't be vaccinated, it's sort of hard to imagine how they can safely perform their job. Obviously, they can't work from home because they need to help their customers into the car and then take them to appointments. If the driver's employer has decided to mandate the vaccine, the driver who can't be vaccinated probably can be excluded from the workplace per the EEOC guidance. But then the EEOC's position is that the employer will need to, for example, review collective bargaining agreements, employment contracts, its policies regarding leaves of absence, for instance, or other sources of rights to leaves of absence, and so forth, to determine whether and when the employee's employment can be terminated. Another question that I mentioned earlier has come up is whether employers can make vaccination a condition of hire. Let me just go back because the slide is not matching. There we go. I must have skipped right over that. But yeah, this is another question that I mentioned came up with one of our clients. And we think the EEOC's December 16th guidance strongly indicates that employers can do this, as long as they are still making reasonable accommodations for anyone who's disabled or holds a religious belief that prevents them from being vaccinated. Now, it's a little trickier in the pre-hire context. Because as you can see here, the EEOC also makes clear that before making a job offer to an applicant, employers can't ask disability-related questions or perform any medical exams. So we think it's fine, probably, at least as of right now, to alert applicants orally and in the job description that vaccination is a requirement of the position, if it is. But you'll probably want to instruct applicants not to say whether they need a reasonable accommodation until after they have a conditional job offer. That way, if the applicant says they can't be vaccinated, you can ask the follow-up questions necessary to determine if the applicant is disabled or otherwise requires a reasonable accommodation. In addition, by not asking about the applicant's ability to be vaccinated before a conditional offer is made, you won't run the risk that the applicant will assume and maybe claim that they weren't hired because they can't be vaccinated, when maybe they just weren't the most qualified candidate for the job and you passed on them for an entirely unrelated reason. So you eliminate those risks by making a conditional job offer first and then discussing the vaccination requirement, and if the applicant legitimately can't be vaccinated, determining whether that can be accommodated in the role that you're hiring for. If not, the conditional job offer likely could be withdrawn. All right, now to the slide that I was on a moment ago. Another frequently asked question is whether employers can mandate vaccines even though the vaccines so far have only been authorized for emergency use by the FDA rather than approved, as Lauren was explaining earlier. Quite a number of commentators have suggested that the vaccine's EUA status means that employers can't mandate vaccination. We disagree, but the confusion is understandable. The emergency use authorization statute requires that before an emergency use drug is administered, individuals must be informed of the option to accept or refuse administration of the product. That might suggest, if they can refuse, then employers can't mandate. But read in context, all this language does, in our view, is provide an affirmative duty that patients must give informed consent in the medical sense. And you can see here on the slide what information has to be provided for informed consent. This language does not create a sweeping requirement that employers must refrain from imposing any negative job consequences on workers based on their choice, which they're certainly entitled to make, to refuse the vaccine. We think this reading is correct because the same EEOC guidance that describes this informed consent requirement also repeatedly discusses and contemplates that employers may mandate vaccination. In addition, the part of the emergency use authorization statute this language comes from describes what information must be provided to patients in informational fact sheets. It doesn't set out employment requirements. If Congress had intended to create a sweeping class of worker protections in this emergency use authorization statute, we think it would have done so clearly rather than varying the language among requirements for FDA fact sheets and medical consent guidance. Lauren, back to you. Lauren?
Here we go. So should employers mandate COVID-19 vaccination? We've given you the lawyerly answer that it depends. Either way, the first thing that any employer needs to do, whether you're going to mandate vaccines or have a voluntary program, is you need to build workplace buy-in. We cannot stress enough, and I think everybody on this call would understand, the importance of having a clear and concise workplace communication that is promulgated sufficiently in advance of implementing a policy, that explains the purpose behind the policy and why the rationale of the policy. It's important that whatever policy you choose, it's consistent with your past policies. And if your workplace has already opened, you probably already have safety policies in place, and you just need to make sure that whatever you say in your vaccination policy is consistent with the safety policies that you have in place. And you need to be able to describe the policy consistent with how you will implement it. Some commentators have noted that in the past, people may call something a voluntary policy, but in effect, it's a mandatory policy in how it is implemented. This is one of the things we referred to earlier that the EEOC may view what you consider a voluntary policy to be a mandatory policy if you mandate aspects of how your employers can interact with the workforce, or if you provide certain types of incentives that might lead to a discriminatory effect on certain people. So your policy needs to be clear, it needs to be implemented and promulgated in advance of implementation, and it should state the facts. There is a lot of misinformation out there with respect to vaccines. There are a number of myths with respect to vaccines. There is concern about the fact that these vaccines, as we mentioned before, are subject to EUA authorization and not FDA approval. A number of people don't realize that these vaccines have been tested for safety. The big difference between the COVID vaccines and vaccines that have been subject to FDA approval in the past is really just the duration of the follow-up. Generally speaking, with vaccines, there's at least 6 months of follow-up data that is able to be assessed as part of the approval process. With the COVID vaccines, in connection with the submission for EUA issuance, the follow-up was only 2 months. And that is less important when it comes to safety because, generally speaking, the scientists believe that if there is any safety issue that would arise out of vaccines, you would clearly see that within 6 weeks of vaccination. And they did not see that at all with these vaccines. But one of the things that we still don't have a full handle on is how long does the immunity last? And that is something we are going to see more of as a lot of the clinical trial participants are followed up on by, at this point, we're at 6 months, 8 months, 9 months for a number of them. But it's very important to be able to explain the facts to your employees so they understand the context in which you're implementing your policy. One of the myths that another myth that people have is that the vaccine itself could cause COVID. It does not cause COVID. It does not. None of the vaccines contain a live virus. Some of them contain a gene protein, or a number of them, the J&J, contains an inactivated virus. One of the things you might want to consider is bringing in a medical expert to alleviate some of the concerns that some of your workplace may have. But all in all, it's very important to get the facts out, explain the thought process behind your policy, and alleviate the fears that people have so you can, and do it all in advance so you can have, if there is a disagreement and there are conversations that have to be had, you have plenty of time to have those conversations. One of the things that we recommend is for employers that have not yet opened up their offices, it makes sense to tie the vaccination policy to reopening your office. It sends a consistent message as to how you envision your workplace to be working going forward. And it may, depending on what policy you implement, contain different restrictions for people if they have been vaccinated versus if they haven't been vaccinated. The other thing that we have seen people discuss and we think should be considered is reducing the cost of vaccination. There are there could be side effects. They're very limited, but there have been reports of fever, stomach issues, all within the first day or two of receiving the vaccination. And employers are considering offering extra paid sick time for those side effects, paying for vaccination administrative costs if they're out of the plan, and offering some way of alleviating any indirect costs. And we'll talk about that later on when we talk about the benefits of having on-site vaccination versus not having on-site vaccination. So why consider a mandate or a conditional mandate? Jessica mentioned during her introduction that there are public health reasons to consider mandating vaccinations as a way of protecting the community. Health experts have noted that in order for vaccines to be effective, we have to turn them into vaccinations. And we will only have normalcy, which will help all of us in every industry, if enough people get vaccinated so there can be herd immunity. Right now, the estimate is around 75% vaccination to get to herd immunity. The reason that is important is without herd immunity, you can't ensure that the people who are unable to get vaccinated do not get infected and get sick from the virus. Also, the vaccines, as we mentioned before, they're not 100% effective, so there are certain people who may not get the benefit of a full immune response from the vaccines. The other very important aspect of mandating vaccines is to protect the health of your workers and their families. In the past, voluntary programs have not received much buy-in under COVID. This may be very different, but historically there's been a low compliance rate. A mandatory vaccine will ensure that your workers get the vaccine and ensure their health. Potentially, to the extent the vaccine does prevent transmission of the disease, you're not only protecting your workers, but you're protecting their families as well. To the extent your workers are interfacing with the public, by protecting your workers by mandating vaccines, you are also protecting the public with whom they are interacting. There are clients that you may have who will be interacting with your workers, whether you're in the healthcare industry or even if you're in the consulting industry and members of your workforce would be embedded at a client's workplace. Your client may much prefer having, consultants who have been vaccinated embedded with their own workers than consultants who have not been vaccinated. Obviously, there is a cost if workers get sick. And we're not only talking about people who have, short-term symptoms from the vaccine, from the virus, which we're all well aware of and can be very acute, but there are what we call long haulers, and we haven't yet determined the long-term effects of having COVID. The other thing that you will see, and I'm sure some of you are aware of, is that states and local communities have put in place regulations that govern workplace safety. And in a number of instances, positive cases have required businesses to close. And so, the number of positive cases that you have in your workplace could affect your ability to reopening and staying open. One of the other things I think people have seen now since the start of the pandemic is that there is civil liability that has arisen out of workplace safety issues. For the most part, workers, your employees, will probably be forced to follow or benefit from workers' compensation programs. But workers' compensation does not protect you against whether or not a contractor or the public who interfaces with your workers develops the vaccine. The other thing to be aware of is that there's right now with the new administration, there is the possibility that OSHA will implement stronger workplace safety rules. We've seen that in California already. Under the old administration, there were no COVID-specific rules. People relied on the general duty to maintain a safe workplace as a basis for obligating employers to implement certain measures. That may change under the new administration. It is possible that there will be an emergency temporary standard under OSHA. It is also possible that OSHA will mandate vaccination in certain industries. We have seen that in the past where OSHA has been willing to do that and interested in doing that. So what might a conditional mandate look like? We've actually recently seen one of the law firms, Davis, Wright & Tremaine out of Seattle, coming out publicly with their policy of what you would call a conditional mandate. And they are going to require proof from lawyers and staff of COVID-19 vaccination in order for those individuals to come back into the office and to attend firm events. They will have a program for accommodations. So for people who cannot be vaccinated, they're going to be encouraged to contact HR. And they are offering what we talked about before, a way of additional days for people to get their vaccine or cope with side effects if needed. We've added a quote from the managing partner of that law firm who explains the rationale of the policy as safeguarding the health of their employees and their families, their clients and visitors, and their communities. And points out that this is a way of the private sector to help getting everybody back to more, quote, normalized operations as quickly as we can. So what type of accommodations are required for people to be considering? We've already mentioned to you that in any sort of mandated situation, you must have an accommodation under ADA for a disability, and there must also be an exemption accommodation for religious beliefs. That does not guarantee a right for somebody to opt out of the vaccination, but there has to be an interactive process. Given all the unknowns with respect to COVID and the side effects of having this virus, I think in any situation that vaccination gets mandated, that interactive process is going to be extremely important here. And the interactive process is to assess whether it is possible to have an accommodation without imposing an undue hardship on the workplace. Here again, that is going to really depend on the context in which your employers are going to be working. If, for example, as we mentioned before, there is no way for your employees to perform their essential duties without posing a risk to other people if they are not vaccinated, there may not be an accommodation that's possible. However, if your workplace or your industry is one in which accommodations have been made so far to prevent the virus from spreading and increased infection, and your employees can perform their essential duties without being vaccinated and without posing a risk to others, then accommodations are likely going to be appropriate. So I'm going to hand this back to Jessica, and she'll tell you about whether you should consider a voluntary approach and what factors to be considered there.
First, I think we have the MCLE number. Kelsey?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone. For all attorneys participating in this webcast, please note the MCLE passcode is 0094. This code must be included on your MCLE form to submit for credit. And one more time, that's 0094. Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, Kelsey. Appreciate it. All right. So what are some reasons to consider a voluntary approach rather than a mandate? Well, there are some pretty significant pros and cons on both sides of this debate, but there are some considerations that definitely weigh in favor of encouraging rather than mandating. And quite a few employers seem to be favoring the voluntary approach, at least for now. One big factor is employee morale and retention. Again, there is a lot of anti-vaccination sentiment out there, quite a lot of misinformation as well, and of course, everything about the virus has been politicized. So employers understandably don't want to anger or upset employees who don't have a legitimate medical or religious reason why they can't be vaccinated, but just don't want to be. Quite a number of polls have supported the notion that about half of American adults are willing or even eager to be vaccinated, but the other 40 to 50% are not. I saw one poll that estimated that about 38% of Americans would be inclined to refuse to be vaccinated, but 13% of them would be vaccinated if their employer insisted. Another more recent report said that 29% of Americans would get it, but only if required. That still leaves quite a few workers out there who say they would refuse even if their employers mandated vaccination. Are employers going to risk policy that may require them to exclude that many workers from the workplace? Some will, for example, because it's just critical to their business, but many others may not. Another huge factor, as you can see here on the slide, is the administrative challenge of sorting through all of the medical and religious exemption requests that employers may receive. Again, because many employees don't want to be vaccinated, we may see employees attempting to rely on disabilities or religion in order to receive a reasonable accommodation. Maybe they don't even have a huge problem with vaccination, but they just want to continue to work from home. As many of you know, a disability under the ADA includes a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So I could imagine workers claiming that they have anxiety, for instance, and that being vaccinated, if it goes against their non-religious beliefs, for instance, they just think vaccines are unsafe long-term or might cause severe short-term side effects, I could imagine them saying that would exacerbate their anxiety to an unacceptable level. And there isn't much. I'm sort of trying to keep an eye on the questions, and there are a ton of great questions in the chat as I expected. There's not much that employers can do to ensure that an employee truly is disabled or has a sincerely held religious belief that prevents them from being vaccinated. Under the ADA, employers can seek medical certification, documentation that proves that an employee requires an accommodation. But it might not be very difficult for employees to find medical professionals who will provide them notes along those lines. If the employee is able to come up with such documentation, employers risk disability discrimination claims by questioning the disability too closely. And the same thing is true with regard to religion. If someone asserts that they have a sincerely held religious belief, it's challenging and risky to really question that assertion. One thing that we might recommend is having a form that reminds people that non-religious beliefs, don't count essentially for this purpose. But then if they're still willing to put, in writing, I have a sincerely held religious belief, that, again, it would be risky to really challenge that. So then the employer is in the position of needing to engage in the interactive process to determine if there is a reasonable accommodation available or whether providing accommodation would result in an undue hardship to the employer. Luckily, most of your companies probably already have procedures in place to do this, but there could be a pretty significant uptick in the amount of reasonable accommodations that employers are having to consider. This might also be a good time to consider training your frontline supervisors and managers about the reasonable accommodation obligations and the interactive process that your company has to go through when someone claims to have a medical or religious reason why they can't be vaccinated. Next factor here is related. If the employee is unhappy with the accommodation that's offered or not offered, there is the risk of claims under the ADA and Title VII for alleged discrimination or failure to accommodate. And as Lauren mentioned, I think, employees are not entitled to the reasonable accommodation of their choice. If there's another reasonable accommodation that allows them to perform their essential job functions, the employer gets to dictate that. But again, if employees are unhappy, they may end up deciding to bring some sort of claim. If an employer decides not to mandate the vaccine for any purpose, as opposed, if they just decide to encourage it, then they really don't assume this risk of medical or religious discrimination claims from employees who refuse to be vaccinated. But there are, of course, other civil litigation risks, such as claims that the employer failed to meet a standard of care to protect health and safety. Again, for employees, that civil liability risk is likely to be covered by workers' comp, but it wouldn't be for, third parties, vendors, customers, and the like. All right, next factor, some employers may choose to encourage rather than mandate just because it isn't that important in their industry. And Lauren has mentioned the importance of context in determining policies here. For workers who aren't customer-facing or traveling regularly or working right on top of each other like in a meatpacking plant or taking care of people in vulnerable populations like in a long-term care facility, it may be that masks and social distancing in combination with remote work, perhaps, are sufficient to prevent a direct threat to clients and coworkers. Finally, employers might just want to wait and see whether encouraging the vaccine results in a sufficiently high percentage of workers getting vaccinated. Taking that approach early on, just to encourage rather than mandate, particularly now when the vaccine still isn't universally available and a lot of workers aren't yet eligible. That doesn't foreclose a later decision to mandate the vaccine if employees are too reticent. Can employers offer incentives? Many employers, and Lauren mentioned incentives earlier, many employers are interested in sort of a middle ground approach. Rather than merely encouraging or going so far as to mandate, employers that we've been working with seem really to like the idea of offering incentives to be vaccinated. And therefore, it's a little frustrating that the EEOC has not issued any clear guidance yet regarding the use of incentives in this context. What they have done is issue new proposed wellness program rules that indicate that, and they're not specific to COVID-19 vaccines at all, but they do indicate that an incentive that is more than de minimis may not be allowed because then it turns a voluntary program into a mandatory one, as Lauren mentioned earlier. So essentially if the incentive is too attractive, workers may not feel they truly have a choice whether to be vaccinated. And the EEOC has said that de minimis incentives would include things like a water bottle or a small gift card. The EEOC seems to be viewing its proposed wellness rules as applicable in this context. EEOC Commissioner Keith Sonderling encouraged employers to read the proposed rules and submit comments relating specifically to COVID-19 vaccine incentives. But a large number of employer organizations subsequently sent a letter to EEOC Chairperson Charlotte Burrows asking the EEOC to quickly issue guidance clarifying the extent to which employers may offer employees incentives to be vaccinated without running afoul of the ADA or other laws. The letter noted that wellness incentives have been closely scrutinized over the years and are the subject of recent regulations. But the organization's position in the letter was that the current crisis can be distinguished from wellness programs, suggesting those rules shouldn't even apply here. And so we're just waiting to see if the EEOC responds. In the meantime, quite a number of companies already are offering incentives. A number of grocery stores, including Kroger and Trader Joe's, have done so. McDonald's has offered incentives, as has Dollar General. Healthcare facilities have done it as well. These incentives have included cash bonuses, pay in lieu of time off or additional paid time off, substantial gift cards like the Airbnb and the like. I personally like the idea of incentives, and I agree that the EEOC should issue guidance, making clear that incentives can be more than de minimis and that the wellness program rules either don't apply or aren't violated when that occurs. A related question that's come up for employers is whether they need to offer an alternative to someone with a legitimate medical or religious exemption. As you can see on this slide, Kroger, for example, is offering $100 to employees who get vaccinated or to employees who cannot be vaccinated but complete an educational COVID-19 safety course online. Now, we say here on the slide that an alternative must be provided, but please note that's just to avoid facing possible discrimination claims as set forth here. It isn't entirely clear as a matter of law that alternative incentives, in fact, are required, but if you don't offer them, there is a risk, certainly, that employees who can't be vaccinated would claim disability or religious discrimination, and perhaps also a violation of the wellness program rules. Another question that comes up a lot is whether employers should offer vaccination on site. And I think I've seen some questions to that effect in the chat. If employers aren't going to mandate the vaccine and are merely going to encourage it, then providing vaccination on site seems like a really great idea. Anything that reduces barriers to vaccination has the potential to increase participation. And eliminating the hassle of having to go seek out a vaccine at a pharmacy or a doctor's office could be really helpful. But for employers who are mandating the vaccine, the question of whether to provide vaccination on site requires a different calculus. So the EEOC has very helpfully made clear, and this is really important, I think, the EEOC has made clear that asking employees whether they have been vaccinated or even vaccinating them, those are not medical inquiries or a medical examination under the ADA. However, the pre-screen questions that accompany the vaccination are medical inquiries under the ADA, and the EEOC said that as well. So there is, definitely a possibility that those questions could implicate the ADA and also the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA. And that act essentially prohibits you from asking about family history information and genetic information of your employees. So note that the EEOC says that even if the employer doesn't provide the vaccine itself, but if it contracts with a third-party provider to do so, then the third-party provider is asking those medical pre-screen questions on the employer's behalf. So essentially, the employer is collecting the information, even if it tells that third-party provider not to share it. It's sort of an agency theory. So if the vaccine is voluntary, it's not a problem, because then the information in response to the pre-screen questions is not compelled. But if the vaccination is mandated, then the employees have no choice but to answer those questions, and that's where you could get into trouble under the ADA or even possibly GINA. So employers that are mandating the vaccine are possibly better off not providing the vaccine on site, but just asking employees to get the vaccine on their own, and then provide proof of receipt of the vaccination. And it's my understanding that, because I saw some questions about this too, that, the healthcare provider, the pharmacy, the doctor can provide something that clearly indicates, that the vaccine was provided and on what date and to whom and all of that. And you are allowed to collect that information. It is not medical, okay? Likewise, I've actually heard about vaccine passports that companies are putting together. That raises a host of issues. But, there will be ways for employees to demonstrate that they have met your requirement or have, gone ahead and gotten vaccination, even if it's just strongly encouraged. EEOC Commissioner Sonderling described this as an out that the EEOC gave to employers. In other words, the option to mandate vaccines without administering it themselves and then just seeking proof of vaccination. That said, just because proof of vaccination is not a medical inquiry and vaccination itself is not a medical examination according to the EEOC, that does not mean that there is zero privacy implications. It removes certain ADA concerns, but vaccination status is still likely to be viewed as sensitive, personal, or health information. Those records still should be held confidentially and separate from employees' personnel files, along with other health information. Moreover, we recommend only sharing employee vaccination status on a need-to-know basis. Most managers will not have a need to know, and I think you'd prefer they weren't aware who was vaccinated and who wasn't, because then there's a risk they might ask the worker, why haven't you been vaccinated? Which again could lead to the compelled disclosure of medical or religious information. Again, the EEOC has made clear asking workers for proof of vaccination or about their vaccination status isn't a medical inquiry, but the follow-up question of why weren't you vaccinated is very likely to elicit medical and perhaps even genetic information like family medical history. So then both the ADA and GINA may be violated. In addition, if a supervisor were to take any sort of adverse action against a worker who hasn't been vaccinated, the employee may claim the treatment is a result of discrimination or retaliation under the ADA or Title VII because the employee could not be vaccinated. And there's even a possibility a manager would take adverse action against the unvaccinated worker on that basis. For example, deny the unvaccinated worker an opportunity, perhaps providing it to a vaccinated worker instead, without giving due consideration to reasonable accommodations that might allow the unvaccinated worker to perform the role or duty safely. So in short, we recommend guarding this information pretty carefully and not just allowing it to be used for any purpose. That said, certain management level employees may have a need to know. For example, if someone they manage is going to a client site and the client has asked that no one comes onto their premises who hasn't been vaccinated. Obviously, you want to be able to use this information to make key business decisions, but we do recommend caution with respect to both privacy and the potential for discrimination or retaliation claims. Finally, if an employer is collecting information that the EEOC says is medical, such as responses to pre-screening questions that are either posed by the employer or a third-party provider that the employer has contracted with to administer the vaccine on site, then employers need to be really careful about securing that information. In addition, they should ensure that any health questions employees are obligated to answer are job-related and consistent with business necessity as required by the ADA. Employers also should describe to employees how they intend to collect, use, and share this information. They should minimize the level of detail to that which is necessary to ensure safe vaccinations and get informed consent. They should keep the health information separate and secure. I mentioned already keeping them apart from the personnel files. They should limit access on a need-to-know basis and consider aggregating on an anonymous basis to give a more global picture of how the workforce is doing overall versus providing individual medical information. They also should limit data retention, for example, by being thoughtful about what information needs to be retained and for how long. So I just want to say thank you all so much for listening and being with us today. We're not quite finished, but Lauren is going to wrap us up.
Great. One of the questions on a lot of people's minds is when can employers stop requiring masks? In the short term, mask mandates and social distancing are still necessary even if you have vaccinated workers, and that is because we are still learning to what extent the vaccines prevent transmission of the virus. There seems to be some sense in the scientific community that it will reduce transmission, but that is something that that the scientific community is still developing information about. As we mentioned before, vaccines are not 100% effective, although they're very, very close, and there are individuals with medical conditions who will not be able to get vaccinated. Some people have asked in the past about what the effect of the variants will be. What we've seen so far is that some of the vaccines, the first few vaccines really weren't tested on people who were exposed to the variants. The J&J vaccine did show a slightly less effectiveness on the South African variant. The consensus seems to believe, at least of the variants that we're aware of right now, there may be a diminished effectiveness, but the vaccine should still be very, very highly effective. Here again, this is an area that Dr. Fauci is focused on. He actually announced yesterday that the CDC is going to be publishing new recommendations on social distancing for people who have been fully vaccinated for COVID-19. So we will be able to have more guidance once the CDC issues those recommendations. The important thing to remember is that it's a point Jessica made at the beginning, that both the science and the law and government regulations associated with the law are evolving every day. We have a new administration in place. There may be new policies that are going to be put in place. And it's always important to continuously to stay abreast of all these developments when you're formatting or formulating the policy that works for your circumstances. So with that, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. We will be available to answer questions if you reach out to us. We've provided contact information if you reach out to us individually. We have tried to address the questions as they've come through in the window, and hopefully we've addressed a number of them. But feel free to reach out to us in the future, and that will conclude our webcast for today. So thank you very much.